Right. So another one bites the dust with the Criminal Assets Bureau.
Which one are you talking? You're not talking about your...
What?
Who bites the dust?
Alan Boggans. He's in trouble.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, he's been hit with a 50,000 euro bill.
Thank you.
By the Attorney General. So that would, I suppose...
So by the Attorney General?
Well, I mean, the Attorney General would be the formal registration of that debt. So that would be somewhere from within the state. So it could be to do with tax or anything like that. Sometimes these judgments are registered by the Collector General.
Well, it's not a proceeds of crime case, I imagine, because we haven't seen it go through the court. So it has to be a revenue case, does it not?
It does.
Judgment of €50,110 on April the 3rd. We know that Boggans, and indeed his son Lee Boggans, has been the target of the Criminal Assets Bureau before. 20 cars in 2017 were taken out of Lee Boggans. What was the car company called at the time?
I think it was called Titanium Car.
Titanium Cars, and we haven't seen that come anywhere yet in the proceeds of crime lists or revenue. But nonetheless, they have been targeted by the Criminal Assets Bureau. Alan Boggans is a bit of a name from the past, in a way. He brings me back to the days when there was a lot of activity around City West, and when you had the likes of Lee Cullen and Christopher Gitt Russell sort of knocking around in that general region. And of course, both of those would have been associates of Alan Boggans. He was in jail for a long time, almost 10 years, and is only recently, or is it last year he was released?
Yeah, I think last year he was finally out. He was literally one of the most significant drug dealers in Dublin. Became very, very successful, made a lot of money. As you said, he operated, he was regarded by the guards as being the joint leader of a criminal gang. Now, that criminal gang operated in connection with, I suppose, the Kinahan cartel, but really more likely the Byrne organised crime gang. However, they also operated to a degree independently. Ultimately, he was convicted and given a 13-year sentence after being caught with €2 million worth of cannabis. In, I suppose, interestingly, again in a industrial estate in Greenogue in County Kildare. Amazingly. I remember talking to somebody at the time, and they said Alan Boggans was totally in charge of this, but he was an absolute control freak. And
you say again in Greenogue, because for those who don't know exactly, Greenogue was the subject of a search in January 2017, an industrial unit up there where there was a array of weapons discovered which were belonging to Thomas Bomber Kavanagh. They had just arrived into Ireland. It was many of them were actually primed and ready for shooting, and it was described as there was a kind of almost an anniversary Armageddon being planned in relation to the Kinahan-Hutch feud, and the seizure of the weapons was an intelligence-based operation by the Garda's Drug and Organised Crime Bureau. Amongst the seizures was a invoice that was sent to the National Crime Agency, which ultimately resulted in the downfall of Bomber Kavanagh. That whole story plays out on the BBC's Kinahan series, which has now concluded, actually, but if anybody recorded it, or I think it's available on YouTube, even though we shouldn't say that, and it's on the BBC Player for anybody listening in the UK or Northern Ireland. But anyway, Greenogue, same place, same spot, Rathcoole, sort of just outside Dublin, west outside Dublin, and near enough to that whole City West complex.
Exactly, and Boggans, as it was said to me at the time, he had it all directed. He'd brought it all in, but he was a control freak, and he had to go down and actually check in it and see it and make sure everything was okay. And the guards had been waiting for him, and they arrested him, effectively caught red-handed. And it was a major coup, I suppose, for the Gardaí at the time, even though Alan Boggans wasn't one of those names that was being constantly in the papers, because although he was an extremely successful drug dealer, he didn't have that high profile. He, like that gang that included Christopher Gitt Russell, who was originally from Cabra but ended up living on the south side. They rose really, really quickly. Certainly, they were sponsored by people like Bomber Kavanagh, but probably even more directly sponsored by Hatchet Kavanagh and Paul Rice. Those were the guys that they were dealing with, and they became a very significant drug dealing gang, particularly in that part of West Dublin. Probably before the sort of rise of people like Peadar Keating, though they would have been associates of them, and probably to a degree before the rise of people like the family. Who certainly were in operation then, but hadn't become the monstrous sort of criminal organisation they ultimately would become. Boggans had been involved in various types of criminality really all his adult life.
Plus he was listed as a roofer with a legitimate business, and he had, a year before he was caught with these drugs, he had built a huge property at Piedmont Road in Newcastle, in behind, sort of in rural part of Dublin and off the road. Not that you talked about him being low key. This was pretty big.
It was.
But it was hidden away. It wasn't a kind of a big extravagant mansion that you could see from the road. But nonetheless, the building or the house was 3,000 square foot.
Yeah, and
there was other developments on the land with stables and, other equestrian, I think, training tracks and this kind of thing on it. So he was kind of like moonlighting as a legitimate businessman, a horse trader, a roofer. He had a guttering business as well, listed to that address. But all the while, Gardaí suspected he was one of the biggest cannabis dealers in the country. Christopher Gitt Russell, he fell out with the Kinahans over a big drug debt, as did Lee Cullen. There was money owed that went missing. I'm just trying to recall the exact details
of it.
Well,
I mean, it was a multi-million-pound bill was in dispute.
I think what happened to him actually was he owed money to the Kinahans, but he also got a massive big sort of proceeds of crime case came at him from the Criminal Assets Bureau, and either his funds were frozen or he just couldn't raise the money, and it caused huge problems. And then Hatchet Kavanagh was in the middle of it, and there was supposed to have been a payment by Russell through Hatchet to the Kinahan organisation in a suitcase that seems to have gone missing somewhere out around City West. And one of these crazy stories which really centred on the Mansfield family, the late Jim Mansfield Sr., who, of course, after his death was revealed as being a banker to gangland, and he was heavily involved with laundering money for a lot of these individuals. But there was a couple of crazy stories around all that. Lee Cullen, of course, who was a personal friend of Jim Mansfield Jr., wound up also owing a huge revenue bill. I noticed that he still owes quite a huge revenue bill of 700,000 or 800,000, which he hasn't yet paid and is unlikely to do so because he's in jail now in the UK. But he sort of was suffering with, he was under so much stress to pay back money between, the state came knocking, plus the kind of the dirty money bills that he owed. He went out to Birmingham to live with his family, and he was working alongside Thomas Kavanagh, and he was ultimately found with a gang who were bringing in parts of guns and putting the guns back together and then trading in them.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we were told at one time Lee Cullen owed so much money to Bomber Kavanagh that he would have had to work his lifetime to pay it off. And that's what Bomber sort of demanded that he did. He became a kind of indentured servant to him, where he was just working to pay off his debt, and he was being given these jobs and treated really badly. Certainly with Gitt Russell and Boggans, they seem to have got in trouble as well. As you said, there's a lot of these elaborate stories about where suitcases of money went or didn't go, but it did become a very serious situation. There was shots being fired at homes. There was threats for this money to be returned. And I suppose Alan Boggans in the middle ended up getting caught. the Boggans organised crime gang, which is what it was called at the time, became a focus for Gardaí, in particular because of a pipe bomb attack that was at the home of a very well-known, very well-regarded detective. In Halloween night, I think in 2011, a pipe bomb was left outside his home. Ultimately, it was there was a man was convicted of that offence. He was a very close associate of Kit Russell. He served a lengthy prison sentence, but that really focused the Gardaí on this gang. Although Boggans wasn't meant to have approved of that or even sanctioned it, but that organisation then became sort of a prime focus for them, really.
He was jailed in 2013 and received a 13-year sentence. So he...
Yeah, I mean, he was caught effectively red-handed, and he didn't take the plea. He put it through a trial, and when you put it through a trial, you're going to get that extra sentence. I mean, 13 years is a very long jail term for any amount of cannabis, you could argue. But what did happen was, when he was convicted and found guilty, often we've talked on this podcast about how the guards will kind of stand up and say, the defence counsel will say, sure, he was a cog in the machine, or he was, give some explanation like that. But the guards were really clear that Boggans was the person who charged, directed and controlled this whole operation. And I think that...
And Judge Patrick McCartan actually praised their work and said that Boggans was the operator in charge of the entire consignment, and that it was not often that someone in his position came before the court. And I quote him, the judge said, invariably it's a man further down the ladder, the driver, the courier, the mule. The court has to send out a very definite message to others involved in drugs in this way, that they can expect no mercy. Isn't it amazing then that it later came up, as is often the case of those really high up the rankings? He found it very difficult to do his prison time.
Yeah, and it was actually said, because some of this is an article I wrote in 2013, or just as he'd been convicted, and it was in that article, somebody said to me, he won't be able to do that prison time at all. He just won't be up for it. And he wasn't. He got himself in all sorts of scrapes behind bars.
Loads of mobile phones. There was a really interesting, you see them appear on the Herald Courts pages, I suppose. Yeah.
You constantly see these stories about criminals being caught with phones. I mean, the sanctions tend to be, not too serious. But he got caught twice in 2015. And then the next story we had with him was in 2017. He was the DJ at the Lifers Christmas party in Joy. So, the people serving life, they get these extra Christmas parties once a year.
Man disco, like.
I suppose. Well, they don't bring in the ladies, I don't think, for the night. So he was the DJ, and it was said, Pat O'Connell wrote the article at the time, he was still allowed DJ, even though he'd just been caught with his 7th mobile phone behind bars 2 weeks earlier. He was still allowed to spin the decks for.
And a family man, because at another occasion he described having a phone and using it to speak to his wife because there was a problem with one of his kids, and he was really concerned about it. Now, so he has 2 children, and one of them is Lee Boggans, who has, often, as his father was in prison, he would send tributes to him on his social media sites, his Facebook sites. He'd talk about the kind of, he was on a countdown to when his father would get out. And of course, the family, the property there that Boggans developed up in Newcastle. Newcastle?
Yeah, Newcastle.
Yeah, Newcastle, sorry. Lee Boggans has himself applied for planning permission for a home there, and it's described to the Board Planola and to the South Dublin County Council as, he needs a home for himself and his own partner and child.
Yeah.
That, the site is there and they want to build it, and it seems to be a kind of a family site. That they all sort of live together. It's obviously, you often see these people who do make it high up the ranks of criminality are also got this sort of second life for their doting parents and doting husbands. And
yeah, I mean, Lee Boggans certainly has big plans for that land. But planning is a controversial issue in County Dublin as well. Lee Boggans would be known for being involved with horses. Obviously, the sulky racing is a big part of it's a big business really in Dublin and beyond. And Lee Boggans would be associated with that. There's a lot of horses are sold and bought and sold. There's huge money involved that people travel from all parts of the country for some of these races. And
there's another word Eamon Dillon was telling me, that it's not called the sulky racing, is the stuff on the motorways.
Yeah.
There's another, is it called
trotting or is
it? Kart racing or something like this?
Yeah.
Is the kind of the legal version of it,
Yeah.
which does happen in particular parts of the country on particular race occasions. And it's the horses involved in that kind of thing that are really valuable. They're put out to stud and, they're bought and sold in the same way racehorses are.
Yeah, for huge amounts of money. It certainly it stretches across Ireland and England, and people travel over, and and
Eamon Dillon said it's huge in France.
Huge in
bigger
France
than
as well. Right.
The
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a long
race.
It's a long tradition, and now it's a separate tradition. In fairness to the normal horse racing, that's a totally different set. But there's huge money horses are exchanged for, up to six figures at times. So it's a big business.
So Boggans is out and he's home, and he's now been hit with a big bill. So it's not all quite over for him.
No, not all quite over, but yeah, he
and now he's having an outing on Crime World.
Yeah, now he's having an outing on Crime World, but
this is his first outing, is it?
It is his first outing. I mean, it's kind of a
welcome to the family, Mr. Boggans.
Yes, we might get you to DJ at our Christmas party yet.
Exactly. Okay, thanks, Niall.
Thanks, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.